hindsight being 2020, I would have raised capital earlier. You can get to a point where you're proud of things you should no longer be proud of. The things that you're proud of can inhibit you. Once you've been bootstrapped for 10 years and everybody's like, wow, you've grown this great company, all bootstrap. How impressive is that? That becomes your identity. It becomes a blocker when it's like, does that mean I'm less successful if I take funding?
For today's episode of In Depth, I'm really excited to be joined by CEO of 1Password, Jeff Scheiner. Jeff joined 1Password in 2012 when the team was about 20 people. There have been two formative shifts over the company's nearly 20-year history. The first is that 1Password was a consumer-only product for 15 years before it added B2B, which now makes up 2/3 of its ARR. The second is that 1Password was profitable from day one and was famously bootstrapped for 14 years before taking outside capital in 2019 with a $200 million Series A. Jeff and I dive deep into all of these topics in our conversation, plus other less obvious milestones on their path to product market fit.
Well, thanks so much for joining us.
Yes, happy to be here.
Maybe we could start with the sort of story about how you got involved with the company.
Yeah, I've been, 13 years now. It's been a long time. And so it started with two founders. So Dave and Sarah Rustam and Natalia, those were the two founding families of 1Password. Well, Dave and Sarah had been friends of mine for many years ahead of time. Back in the late 90s, very late 90s, I was actually Dave's boss at IBM. And so we were building e-commerce back at the time, and he and I worked together. And then we both moved to townhomes, which turned out to be just up the road from each other, technically on different streets because we kind of backed onto each other, but just up the road. So we became family friends for a number of years, and then both sort of moved our way, both from a work point of view and also from a, where we lived point of view. And then around the end of 2011, that Dave reached out to me and said, hey, he's got this company, and it was getting bigger. It was up in, getting close to 20 people. And he wants to build and invent. He doesn't necessarily want to run a big company, which, when you go from nothing to 20, it's a big company. And I was working in the US. I still lived in Canada, but I was doing the road warrior thing, leaving Sunday night and doing consulting, actually e-commerce consulting from Sunday night to Friday and then driving home. And we had actually just been sold to Publicis. So when I had started there, it was a company called Berlant. It was about 200 people. We'd grown it, merged with a company called Rosetta. So now we were Rosetta, and then just sold to Publicis. And so, it was, do I want to be part of a large 50,000 person company again? Do I want to try something new? So it was great timing for me. As a result of that, I spent some time with Dave, spent some time with Rustam, looked at the company, really got excited mostly by what they were trying to accomplish, right? That combination of productivity and security, make an app for people, build a good product, support the heck out of your customers. That was their way of building the company, which really appealed to me. And so it just became, this is great. I want to be a part of this, and we'll just figure it out as we go. And that's what we did.
So what was the state of the company? You said it was about coming up on 20 people.
Yeah, it was all consumer at the time. Honestly, it was mostly Mac. It was like Mac and iOS. It was very, very little. I think they had a reader for Android and something similar for Windows, but it was really very much of an Apple-focused company, around 17 or 18 people. I can't remember the exact number, but again, very small, but growing. It was growing organically, and the company was doing well from that perspective. But that was it. There wasn't a vision, I would say, other than build a good product and support the heck out of their customers, which is what the company was. It was about half, I'll say, engineers, half customer support. But even back then, that mix itself was very mixed. So almost every night, we would make sure all of the customer questions were answered. Doesn't matter who of us were answering, we're all answering the questions. And that's how we grew, is by listening to the customers back then. And it was all license-based as well. And that was the interesting thing. So it was, you would buy the license of, 1Password 4, maybe it was, or 3. I can't even remember the version back then. And you would hold that, and then you'd sync through something like Dropbox or iCloud. It's a very young company, but it was, even back then, the brand was known and the brand was well respected.
And what was the origin story of the company when it got off the ground? Like, where did the idea come from?
It's a little bit of it, an inside joke / lore of it was a 30-day project. That's what it was. So Dave and Rustam had a web company where they would build you a website. You got to remember, this was 2005, right? That happened back then. And they couldn't win their bids. They were always being underbid. And so they thought, well, okay, most of those websites were going to be commerce websites and things like that. And they were building them for small companies. They had to do that very inexpensively, but you still needed things like to be able to sign in or to be able to add your address or credit card. And so they thought, one of the ways that we can make it less expensive is to automate some of the testing. We'll just spend a few weeks, build this tool that will allow us to autofill so that when we do testing, we can use that tool to autofill addresses and credit cards and sign in and do that sort of stuff. And as they started to build it, they started to realize, well, this would be really useful like for themselves. And so they added the security part to it so that it would be more than a testing tool to actually be secure. And they thought, wow, this is really actually quite useful for themselves. And so they put it out there on the shareware sites and that where you could go and charge, I don't know what they charge, $20 or whatever they charged for the app back then. And pretty quickly people started buying it and they actually started making more money from 1Password than they were making at their own job. And it wasn't long after that that they said, well, this is our way forward, is to actually do what's A, making us money, and B, is the product that they found so useful. It's kind of an interesting story. And I mean, you got to remember, they're living, I think, at their parents' houses. It's the typical bootstrap out of their own garage, as it were. But yeah, so it must have been quite the experience for them.
So you mentioned this maybe at a little bit of a high level, but what did you see in them and what they had built, given things were still so nascent when you committed to joining them?
Yeah, I think there's two sides of it. There's the company/product side, and then there's the personal opportunity side. For me, it was just, don't get me wrong, I loved my time at IBM. I still say I blew in my blood. The time at Berlant was really transformative for me as I went from the architect to actually running the P&L of a big part of the company. But there was just such an appeal to, again, being part of something where I could really make a difference. I went back to being the programmer with all the challenges that took at the beginning, because I'd never programmed, on iOS or Mac before. And it had been a while, but like that was fun to be able to have such influence on a small company and be part of that small group, as opposed to, and I don't mean it meanly, but being a cog in a much bigger wheel. So personally, I found that very appealing, was just to be able to be a part of that and make that difference. But at a company level or at a product level, again, both from the way that they ran the product and the product itself, I'd been in e-commerce again since the late 90s when IBM had brought me in. I started to see that e-commerce was really taking off. This was, again, 2012 at this point in time that I actually joined. And there was a need for security online. There was even just the knowledge of needing to be secure online was just starting to creep up in people's mindsets, right? The development community that worked online, that worked on the new products and stuff like that, they were already recognizing, and that was very much who our customers were at the beginning, was just other tech people who started to see the type of data that was being stored online and started to realize, hey, there's a wealth of information here that needs to be protected. But the average person on the street was just starting to understand that using, fluffy cat for their password wasn't a good thing, but didn't have anything they could do about it. And here we had something that not only could they use 1Password to stay protected, but we wanted their input. We wanted to know how to make it easy. We wanted to understand, how do we make it actually useful for them? All you can aim for is not being intrusive with most security tools, right? You think of a lot of security tools and they're stopping you from doing things. You think of maybe a VPN as sort of that middle ground of it just runs and you hope it's doing something good and it usually doesn't get in your way. Here we could actually make your lives easier, because not only could you be more secure, but just logging in, just filling in credit cards and addresses and stuff like that was so painful back then, and most companies didn't even remember it for you and stuff like that. We can make your lives easier and more secure. And that was just super appealing at a time when the internet and internet shopping was itself just really starting to mature. So it was a lot of fun.
When you decided to join, did you think it is likely this can be an absolutely massive company? What was kind of your mindset around the potential trajectory to build a really very, very large business?
I still kind of think this way. I used to have a saying like, I can double the size of your company. And I meant that by people, because I can always look around and say, there's Sue, there's Chris, whomever. They're doing a good job. We could have another Chris. We could have another Sue. But I didn't know what to do with 10 Sues. I didn't know what to do with 10 Chris's. So I could see the growth. I could see the opportunity. And I could see, again, this is a case where it sounds somewhat silly, but it's like everybody in the world needs 1Password. And you think that's, for the most part, true. But I didn't think of at the time of, hey, we're going to be multi-billion-dollar companies and that's the opportunity. That wasn't the allure. That wasn't the appeal. But there was very much of people need this. Like, we can really help a lot of people. I didn't know what a lot was. I I didn't have it in my mind of here's this humongous opportunity that's going to grow into something that where I'd be sitting here today or things like that. But I did see the opportunity to protect a lot more people than were there. It was a problem that was, I think everybody could start to recognize. And that was appealing to me. I think it was probably a few years later that I started to realize, yeah, there's a really big opportunity with this.
Did a lot of your peers and former coworkers think this was odd, what you were going to do? Like, was it a weird thing at the time?
Yes and no. I think those who knew me best knew I love to problem solve. I love to sit there and figure things out. I do like to, I'll call it lead, and that's being nice to myself. Like I do like to talk and voice my opinion so that, I think that they knew that I'd like to be in a position where I could help make the decisions, help with the ideas. So I don't think that side of it was a surprise to anyone. I never had this, I want to be a CEO my whole life. Never knew I wanted to be. I always had my career kind of grown by who's the role I want next, like who's doing what I want next. So I don't think anybody looked at it and said, oh, well, Jeff always said he'd want to be a CEO. I had no idea. So that part was a surprise. I think going to such a small company was also a surprise to people because I worked at the large companies. I mean, I'd left IBM once in my early career and worked for a startup. I was not part of the leadership, I was just part of the startup. So that's not super foreign to me. But I do think people were somewhat surprised to going from this company that had grown from 200 people to 1,100, got bought by a 50,000 person company. And I was one of the most senior people there of the 1,100, not of the 50,000 to be clear, that I would then all of a sudden go to the small company. But I think those who knew me knew my career is not based on like, hey, some sort of status. It's based on what's interesting. And I think if you're in computers, especially back in 2012, 2013, it's not all that much different now. You knew that your career was safe. This company hadn't succeeded. It's not like I would never find another job, which hadn't really occurred to me much, but I think it's sitting there in the back, giving you comfort to make some of these decisions that otherwise might seem scary.
You joined as CEO in 2012, and that very rarely works, at least in terms of statistically in Silicon Valley. If you think about founder-led companies that bring a CEO in that early in particular. So when you reflect back on the last 13 years, what's the underpinnings of why it has been such a productive dynamic?
I think there's a few things that came into that. First of all, they did bring me in CEO from a standpoint of when I signed the paper, it said CEO, but we also agreed not to tell anyone. And so for the first 6 months, we didn't tell anyone. Now, I mean, there was only probably 20 of us at the end of the 6 months, and people knew I was there to help lead and stuff like that, but it wasn't ever said formally because, Dave at the time was the formal CEO. And at the beginning of every year, we used to take a cruise. And that year we went to a resort instead, but we were sitting there at the circle and that's where they announced to everybody, okay, this is Jeff's role. So part of the discussion there was like, well, let's make sure it works. Let's make sure at least we think we've got a good opportunity for it to work before we go and disrupt the entire company. And then 6 months later have to disrupt them again. So there was a little bit of, can we see? But I think it came down to a couple things. One is decision-making, the other's personalities. And from a personality point of view, I think there was a really good fit there with Dave, Rustam, and I. Now, I didn't know Rustam at the time. Dave and Rustam are quite intense. They can be quite intense. I am far less so. My emotions are a lot more on the mellow side. And I think I act as a good shock absorber between the two. And so it was always a case of how do we problem solve and how do we lead as a group? Because it wasn't I'm the CEO, go do that. That can work in some companies, but I don't think that can work when you're coming into a company that has leaders. It has to be a case where you work together and lead. And then over time, and this is the tough part, certainly something that I can see not working at other companies in different circumstances, you take the lead. Over the time, you take the lead, and then over time, and that's probably 3 years, I'd say, I took the lead more and more, especially as we got larger inside of the company. Dave and Rustam, we would call, like, Rustam for a time was brain and vision. Dave was heart and soul. And so Dave started focusing more with Sarah on things like the customer support side. Rustam focused more on the new technologies and where we were going to go. And there was just sort of a natural, well, Jeff's going to lead and just going to lead the company, but we were still going to all make sure that we're going in the same direction, eventually to the point where now, again, as board members, they still have the opportunity to stay very much engaged, but they're not engaged in the day-to-day of the business. But again, that took,
Many years.
Took 10 years. And that was something that we all just sort of navigated into. It wasn't planned. It wasn't stated. But I think over time, you need to have a single leader. You can't have 3 leaders for a decade. Shouldn't say you can't. I think that'd be very difficult.
So what were you doing over the first 6 months when you joined? Like every week?
Oh, we were building the app. There was, I believe it was the iOS app at the time that we were building. And we'd spend a few days at Rustam's house, a few days at Dave's house or my place. We had a small group of us. We would come out to California and just spend a week at a hotel. And we were building the app. We were just focusing on that. Now, at the time, as I said, we were also, even though we had some formal customer support at the end of every day, there was always tickets left over that the group of us would make sure were cleared out. And that gave us a great opportunity to talk. I mean, it's email, but talk directly to the customer, find out what they like, find out what they don't like, find out what's working, find out what's not working. And as a result of that, influence the product. Now, there was the financial side as well, which Sarah largely ran from the standpoint of making sure people were paid. But there was also then slowly got into, okay, well, let's actually start to plan the financial side, especially because as an app, as opposed to a subscription or things like that, the big challenge with an app is when you have a renewal, a big chunk of money comes in. And then after that, it's sales. People always look at it from a subscription point of view and say, oh, you want subscription so that you can make more money. No, I mean, you think of our individual, we make $2.99 a month on the individual. We used to sell the app for $75. Like if anything, we're probably making less on it, but that's consistent, right? I remember Sarah and I was talking about, and Dave as well, like the sleep at night factor. I don't go hire that 21st, 22nd, 23rd person if we don't know that we can pay them in 6 months or a year. Like that weighed heavily on us, still weighs heavily on me. And so that was very different where then you start to look at it and say, okay, we've got some really cool ideas. Instead of putting them into the app, let's hold them back. And then let's add them to the next version of the app, because that would make it worthwhile for people to upgrade. The other thing that to me always kind of stunk about having an app as opposed to a SaaS subscription, like if we've got good stuff, like I want to give it to our customers now, but then if we give all our good stuff to the customers now, then they'll say, well, why would I upgrade? But it's things like that we started to think about a little more. Not that they didn't think about them before, but a little bit more. And then as time went on, we started going even broader and looking at new opportunities to eventually where it was B2B.
What year was that?
Probably 2013, although 2014 was sort of the lightning bulb moment. We had started to talk about some of the capabilities of B2B early. And now we were an app, which means we didn't have a SaaS component, which means we couldn't have the concept of sharing. So we had actually put in this, honestly, really, really poor way of sharing through Dropbox where like people would need the same account password to get in and things like that. And it was terrible. And so we were starting to think of ways that we can enable some of this. But what I started to notice was earlier on in the first couple of years, you'd have some companies that would buy copies of 1Password for all of their employees for Christmas to keep their employees safe. And then it started to change for some of the companies, not many, but some of the companies started to buy copies of 1Password for all their employees to keep their business safe. And that was the change. And so I remember I was at a conference and I was just talking to the folks next to me that were having dinner, and they were talking to me about, their use at their company. I think it was, they all individually used 1Password, but their company was thinking of getting LastPass because they had a company account. All of the things that we had been talking about and thinking about just all came whoosh into me at a moment. And it was like, we need a SaaS app and we need a business app. And I went running off. And the next morning I got Rustam at breakfast. He got super excited. I don't think any of us went to the rest of the conference. We booked one of the conference rooms and all spent the weekend there talking about what we could build in this idea. And it was just the start of what became 1Password for Business. It was one of those lightning bulb moments where just everything we had been, floating around your head just solidifies into aha, I know what we need to do.
One of the things that's interesting as you describe the path of the company is it feels like a company where the opportunity unfolded as you sort of built it. The sort of traditional Silicon Valley company is you have some visionary founder and they explain this big idea about how the world is going to change, and then they marshal resources to make that happen over some period of time. And I'm curious, what's your reflection on that?
I mean, you're 100%. I say this with AI a lot, where I think there's going to be 3 phases, broadly speaking, of AI. The first phase was sort of like, do you AI, right? Or, and that really meant do you chat GPT. And then we're in the second phase where every company is leveraging or looking how they can leverage AI, both within their own products, within their own tools, but also for their own use. But it's still, we're thinking the way we do work today. And then we're just thinking of how AI can make that better, right? There's going to be that third phase that I can't quite understand, where it will be completely different. For myself, it's been less of, can I see that third phase of security? Not until we're kind of at phase 2.5. So to your point, I think we can see far enough ahead, but it is by very much listening to the customer. Whenever anyone talks to me, I'll just say that over and over again. Your customer is telling you what's valuable. And I mean customer, not user. The difference is, if you come up with an idea and you go around to all of your family members or frankly, people on the street and tell them you've got this idea, you'll get that's awesome more often than not. You go to those same people and you're like, look at this thing I've got. Will you buy it for $1,000? I don't need one today. And so there's a difference between kind of a cool idea and true value. And so I think you need to have that broader idea, right? The broader idea, even if that idea is something simple like, hey, we can keep people safe on the internet while actually making life easier for them. That can be considered, especially back in the early, or mid 2000s, and that like a pretty revolutionary idea. Most people didn't know they even needed to stay safe. But the how you do it has to be rooted in something real. And that's where it's a case of, looking at your customers and trying to understand what your customers really are telling you. It's the same reason why the Waymo looks like a car and not, if we had started by just saying all vehicles will be self-driving, it probably would have looked completely different. You've got to find a way to get there. And so I agree with you. This wasn't here's this $100 billion company I'm going to build and I'm going to fundamentally change humanity. I'd love to have that sort of idea, and that just wasn't me. But what I can do is I can listen to people. I can start to see the opportunities or the challenges they're facing. And most times it comes in the form of a challenge. Most times people aren't even realizing that they're asking for a solution. They're just complaining about something, or they're just frustrated by something. So I think if you look at it and you stay focused on what's the core idea, and the core idea is how do we make people and now businesses safe online, but in a way that still allows them to be productive. As long as we stay with that mission, with that vision, we can really listen at the customer, business, or individual. And that's the other thing. They're humans, right? I sort of detest this difference between B2B and B2C. There's different needs without question in terms of the problems they're solving. But at the end, like, I'm not business Jeff because I'm talking to you. And then if I go out and get a text from my wife, magically transform into family Jeff. I'm just Jeff, or Shiner, as everybody at work calls me. I just am. And so we're all people, and it's people that we're trying to make more productive while keeping them and their businesses secure. I would agree with you. I think the interesting side of it is, for a lot of cases, if you don't have that magic vision of what the solution will be like, keep that vision of what you're trying to change. What fundamental problem are you trying to change?
How do you translate what you hear from customers into what you should do as a company? Because you could go back to the Henry Ford quote of, you ask people and they say faster horse, but also you don't talk to 30 customers. They all say, well, I need this button and this thing and this thing. And then all of a sudden your product roadmap is created. Over the course of the company, what's that translation look like?
There's two sides of that. There's the what, and then there's the order. Because the order is a little more challenging at times, just because of, you want themes and that to emerge more than just features. But customers will by and large tell you solutions, and you have to dig out of them the problem. And I think spending, 6.5 years in consulting in the US really helped me with two sides of that. One, I used to say, like, for every 21 features the customer is going to give you, there's going to be 7 that we're going to say we're not going to do, 7 that we'll absolutely do, and 7 that we'll talk about how we're going to do with them. Because you can't do them all, right? And some of them just don't make sense. Some of them are so unique to that customer or that situation that they're not going to have wide appeal. So the first thing you need to do is figure out, sorts of features / problems, which are the ones that really fit in your vision, which are the ones that are ours. And you can't go chasing money. You can't sit there and say, well, this large company really wants us to build a video game on the side. You just have to be cautious there. So I think that helped. But I think more importantly, customers will say, I want a report that does this. or I want a feature that does that. And you can build that, but you have to instead really try and understand what problem are they trying to solve. And there's two reasons for that. One, we found in a lot of cases what the customer's trying to solve, we could actually solve 80% of it out of the box, just in a different way. And much of the time, certainly not all, but much of the time, that's completely fine to the customer. Like they're like, oh yeah, that's what I wanted. But humans tend to talk in terms of solutions. And so I think the most important thing to do is to try and understand what's the problem. Even if it's a complaint, like I don't like how blah, blah, blah work, trying to understand why, and then trying to understand, well, is it the case that the customer is trying to do something that's very reasonable and other people are going to want to try and do it in the same way? And now you need to find in your product, how do you solve that problem? Or is the customer trying to do something in their way where, we in our product philosophy are just fundamentally saying, hey, well, we're solving that in a different way. It may not be for them, but I'm not going to try and change the fundamentals of our approach. So I think, first of all, understanding that is a real challenge. And that's where, we spend so much time, so much focus on customer support of its many different ways. We've still got hundreds of folks that are doing customer support. We've always tried to do it in our own groups. We've got now the Dave Chan and the team that goes out and works, especially with the B2B customer. So when we look to build something new, we try and get a bunch of customers involved as early as possible to sit there and say, will you help us form this feature, form this product? Because otherwise we're making it up as we go, thinking we know how to solve a problem that's really theirs. And so if we can get, a bunch of customers, especially business customers now coming in and helping form that feature, boy, that A, gives you advocates from day one, B, gives you real stories as to what problems it solves, and C, it just helps you solve it, in a real way. And so I think it's all about trying to understand the problem behind it. I remember I was at the University of Western in London, Ontario, and was taking Q&A from, it was like a TechX, I think it was called. And it's like their tech accelerator group. And the one university student, and she was asking like, how do you come up with $1 billion idea? And I said, well, you don't. I said, I don't know how to come up with $1 billion idea, but you look for the $1 billion problem. And then you try and figure out if you're the one to solve that problem. And that's how we approach it, is there's going to be a problem out there, and that's going to be worth, however you want to think of it in terms of dollars or whatever, it's worth a lot of value, and somebody's going to gain that value by solving that problem. Then you have to think, are we the ones that are right to solve that problem? That's actually what led to even extended access management, to our newest set of products now, where we looked at it and we said, this is a real problem. But we also said it's a problem in large part because the employees are trying to be productive. The business needs to keep them secure. Hey, that's what we do. Right. And then you have to really think about it. And that's where priorities come into play, where you start to look at it and you say, where does it fit in our roadmap? What's our roadmap themes? Are we focusing on, different segments? Are we focusing on different plans? And that's where I think getting enough of them together that you're not just solving the one problem, but you're solving that class of problems for the customer, because usually if they have one problem, they have a class. So unless that class fits directly into EPM, then we need to look at and building enough of it that we can help solve a broader problem.
When you think about prioritization, do you think about the economic opportunity tied to this set of features or that set of features or this set of problems?
I do. Yeah. I mean, I think you have to. It's only one of the things that goes into there. So again, I look at it first and foremost and I say, do we have an unfair advantage? Are we going to be in a position where it makes sense for us, the company 1Password, to tackle this problem? Even if there's a huge economic opportunity. And it's, I say it kind of silly inside. We're not here to build a game, right? We're here to make people productive and keep people and businesses safe. That's what we do. So if there's a huge economic opportunity that's outside of it, that's just not for us. I think if we don't stay focused in that way, we will eventually struggle and strain. But when you do look at an opportunity, you do have to look at the economics of it. And you have to sit there and say, are we going to be able to put a real solid investment in here and really make it a great product? We had that discussion fairly early on. So we actually had a separate product called Knox, and Knox was a file vault. And this was early on. And we wanted both Knox and 1Password to continue and that, but we got overwhelmed with all of the feature requests and all of the opportunity with 1Password, the password manager at the time, and we couldn't do it justice to Knox. And so we just said, we've got to put Knox aside. I'm not going to allow us to have a small number of people make a, app. I want the app to be great. And so when we look at from a financial opportunity, sure, we're now big enough. We're going to have the finance people and stuff look at it from true finance. But I'm going to look at it from a standpoint of, I want to build something that I can build great. And that means I need to be able to justify putting the spend in, putting the people there, putting the focus on so that we can make it great. And I don't want to just build parts that are going to be okay. And now they may start off okay. Again, it's all going to start off somewhere. When we launched 1Password for Business back in 2016, I mean, we called it 1Password for Teams, and it was like really maybe 1Password for bowling leagues. Like it was, but it was V1. You just keep iterating. That's fine. But the goal's got to be great.
Why do you think that's so important? I mean, said differently, that's obviously the thread for anybody that's used your products is that they are great. But if you look at most enterprise software companies that are worth more than $100 billion, no one would say that their products are great. Do you ever think about that?
I do. I mean, there's some that I really enjoy. Slack would be one that I really enjoy. Slack was the one that just seemed to, again, care about the user. And it was little things at the time, even like expanding a Twitter link, I remember was one. I'm sure they all do now, but at the time. And so there was little things. And if you remember going to their website, they had those moments of delight in their website and things like that. That matters to humans, especially I think in security, because security can be scary. At best, you're thinking the security, even if it's not scary, is going to just hold me back. It's just going to make my life more miserable, right? Like that's been our experience with security. So the more we can make it easy to use and friendly and really focus on the human at the end, then the more likely we are to actually be used. Now, at an individual or a family level, that's going to be important because that's how you're obviously, going to make a sale. But at a business level, sure, you can have somebody sitting there and forcing it on you. But imagine that software that your CISO comes up to you and says, hey, you have to use this. And a month later, like, this is awesome. Everybody wins.
I wanted you to go back and talk more about how you actually built the B2B product and got that into product market fit. You shared a couple bits of the story, but it began with you were at this conference, you were talking to somebody, and it sort of occurred to you that you were really well set up to build a business product. What was the 90 days that happened after the conference?
It was, yes, very, very much of duck on water. Yeah. Paddling furiously underneath. So it was, I'm going to say a week after we got a group of about 8 of us into the basement office that we had at the time and the big whiteboard there. And we spent the next few days refining our solution that we were, so tremendously proud of. This thing was so secure. It had service tokens. It had all this type of stuff. It was going to be so secure. And then what we did was we actually went and we came out to California and talked to a few folks that we knew who were high up in CISO type position and that or security positions at companies. And they all told us how crap it was. Nobody's ever going to use this. It's unusable. You get a bunch of security geeks together and we're going to go and sometimes make the biggest mistake of all, which is like, how secure can we make this, right?
Their critique was it was not secure enough?
No, their critique was nobody's going to use it because it was way too secure, to the point of we didn't have a web interface because the things you can't do on the web. It was just, we'd gone overboard. It was a fun exercise, but we'd gone overboard. But there was the nuggets of it they loved. They're like, look, this thing's available. We're buying it in a minute, but it's gotta, it's gotta have these things.
Did you think about, when you were thinking about the early customer base, did you think about the difference between, a company with 30,000 employees talking to their CISO versus a small business with 30 employees? And who were you building for? Or you didn't think about it in that context?
Somewhat. Like we knew the large companies. Now, our goal is you got to build it for the large companies. You got to build it for maybe not the world's most complicated customers, but the every company, right? The every company that's out there, 5,000, 10,000, 100,000 people, but it's a journey. And then you need to understand what they need versus what a company of 2,000 needs versus a company of 200, which is very different from a company of 20. And you need to understand at each spot. But if you don't focus there and say like, what would that company need? You're not going to put the right fundamentals in place. And then you need to start thinking of it in terms of releases and tiers. Like we still have 1Password for Teams and we have 1Password for Business. And then, the enterprises will need it. And now we're doing the exact same thing with the full extended access management, where you look at it and you say, what companies of different sizes need, but your fundamentals have to be there. They're all solving the same problem. With password management, it's three things, only one of which we had with the consumer. So at its broadest, it's one, humans need a way to stop using Fluffy Cat. That's whether you're an individual or whether you're a business, like the risks are there for you as a person, you as a family, you as a business. And that's still where the vast majority of breaches start is credentials. The second thing that a business needs is they need the teaming ability, right? We didn't have a SaaS app at the time. We were just an app. So we needed to build the whole SaaS solution. And that's where we had focused our attentions. And so you can do things like sharing, you can do things like access control and reporting and all of those capabilities, right? And then we needed from a business side, you need to solve the business problems along with the end human problems, which means you need all of the abilities that the CISOs need to understand risk profiles and things like that. When you think of a 20-person company, they all need the first one, they all need the second one. Sure, their sharing may be far simpler. It may be everybody gets this vault. Here's the two people that have access to the social vault. I remember at our company for a long time, there was, three people that had access to the company bank account. Those are the three people you need to share with and stuff like that. Those problems exist. They don't exist at the same level. You may not be using, an IDP at that level, and you're not doing reporting. So you're not doing provisioning. You still need to make sure when somebody leaves your company, you remove their access. So it's degrees, which turns into features to be sure, but it's still the same fundamental problem. I would say that third problem of compliance and things like that are the ones that the small companies it's not that they don't care about. They haven't grown large enough yet to care about. They're like, hey, I may not be around in a year. I'm not going to worry about whether I'm making this compliance. So there's that third one that we, at the time and back in 2016, had sort of purposely put later on because we still hadn't built up the capabilities yet to satisfy the larger companies in 2016. But from a fundamentals point of view, your architecture and your infrastructure is going to largely stay the same. We wanted to build it to scale. So we went in the basement. We then went to California, which was best trip ever because it just demonstrated that what we were trying to accomplish was spot on. We had just done the typical mistake of pendulum swinging too far. I went back, pendulum swing back a little bit the other way, talked to those folks again when we were comfortable that we had it largely right. We started building, and then it was again, building the SaaS app, hiring a number of people. You talked earlier about the financial side. We were bootstrapped. This was our money. We were like, hey, we've got to go and hire a bunch of people that know and can support infrastructure because you're an app. We didn't have an infrastructure before or very little infrastructure, right? We had to hire a bunch of people to help build this new app. So there was a time when, we looked at it and we said like, yeah, we believe in this, but there's also that time when you just got to say, we're jumping in both feet and we're going to go after that. So that's what we did. We jumped in with both feet and it took us about a year to where we got it to where we had our first beta. And I'll tell you a fun story that I share at our company every once in a while. It was somewhere around September, October of 2015. We decided we'd have a free beta for the next few months. And, everybody thought it was a cool idea. Well, the reason we had a free beta is like, we hadn't built any of the billing code. That wasn't important. Billing's like the last thing you want to think about. You want to build the app. You want to make sure the app is good first before you'd worry about billing.
So who were like the first 5 customers, these beta customers for the B2B product? And what did the product look and feel like at that time?
Well, we had started, because we built the SaaS app, we had built it for quote unquote everyone. But by that, what I meant was we had built it for individuals, families, as well as businesses, because there really wasn't a huge difference between what a family needs and what a business needs. Again, other than in degrees. If you think of it, they each need a copy of 1Password, so they don't have Fluffy Cat. You're going to share passwords at your family, right? Even if it's, your Wi-Fi and security codes or things like that, or maybe back then Netflix and stuff like that. And so we had built it and we had actually had the families one go out first as we continued to build some of the capabilities for business. So that helped us understand that, the product would stand up. And again, all of that, we always dog food it ourselves. We always do. As soon as we can get it, I'm not user number one and I'm still upset about that. I think Tim is, who at the time ran our IT because he set up the database. But it's use it yourself and then onboard. I think we did families and then eventually companies who by and large had been waiting for it. So these were back then. So we still didn't have any marketing folks or go-to-market folks. It was people who had gone from being individual users saying, look, as soon as you have it ready, let me know. and we'll try it out. And they did. They tried it out in teams in their companies or in small groups or that, because they'd been waiting for this. They needed it from a business point of view, and they were already loyal 1Password customers.
And did it immediately resonate and work?
It did. Again, I would say back at the time, we didn't have all of the capabilities that a lot of the companies needed, which was just fair. We just flat out didn't. And it was V1 or V0.9 or whatever you want to call it. So the adoption of that wasn't immediate for a lot of those companies. But yeah, again, I would say it resonated even before we had it out there in terms of as a need. And then it's a matter of just building the features that were truly needed. And that was the next few years, was just, what did our company need as our company grew? I'm trying to remember how big our company was back then. Probably, I don't know, maybe 50 people. I'll be wrong, but something like that. And so what does our company need? Then was a company of 500 need? Was a company of 1,000 need? And
did you think about other products in the market and competition and things like that? Or was it never part of the way that you thought about building products?
I always look at competition in two ways. One, you don't want to fight the competition's battle. I don't have a good way of saying it. In other words, if the competition adds a good feature that's legitimately a good feature, you look at it and you say, is that something that we should do? You see that everywhere, right? Like you look at it and you say, like, if they're tackling this problem, right? Whatever the problem is, should we tackle that problem? Even in our own way. But a lot of the times, a lot of the features that are being added aren't that useful. They're flashy or things like that. And so I think if you watch the competition from a standpoint of trying to keep up with them in that way, you're playing their game, not your game. What is it about us that we make great? Well, what makes us great is our focus on the usability, our focus on the human that's using it, not necessarily every report that comes out. And so when we're going to prioritize it back then, because again, you want everything, not everything, but you want to do 10 times as much as you're doing all at once, and you can't. So our priority was going to be, instead of adding a ton of just reports or things that we're going to try and compete directly there, let's just make sure that the things we are known for, make those stronger, and then start making our weaknesses invisible at the beginning. It's the same thing I tell people just from an individual point of view, right? Like if you're going after whatever the next role or the next job, don't try and make your weaknesses your strengths. Like you see that all the time where it's like, this person over here is maybe a great public speaker, and I'm terrible at public speaking. And they'll say, like, so I'm going to take all of these lessons and become a great public speaker. Well, how about you take enough lessons that you become an okay public speaker, that people don't look at it as a negative. And then the things where you're good at,
push on
them. Yeah, exactly. And so it's the same thing. So early on, you have to really focus there, but then your competition continues to change over time. As we evolved beyond password management into broader XAMPP, we have to look at it and say, where's the competition now? And what are we battling against? And that's not even just companies. It's what problems are we trying to solve? So for instance, as we move from password management, back in even 5, 6, but certainly 7, 8 years ago, there wasn't really the same sort of problems that we have today. Not problems, I'd say problems/opportunities that we as humans have today, in terms of now SaaS apps are everywhere. Right? I say somewhat jokingly, software used to be sold on golf courses, right? You get a salesperson, get an executive, 6 months later, you're using Lotus Notes. That's how it worked. Nobody quite sure how in between that works. Now SaaS, you go to a conference, you go anywhere, and it's like, oh, I heard such and such is good. I remember Figma coming into 1Password, where our design team had used Figma. And so I just assumed that's for the design people, right? I can't draw Stickman. Well, then Matt Davey, who's, one of our lead designers, he had a Fig Jam. If you're not familiar with the Fig Jam, it's kind of like everybody gets their cute little sticky notes, but virtual sticky notes. I kid you not, 2 weeks later, every team in our company was doing a Fig Jam. It just blew up like that. And it's that sort of thing that's how software gets in. And we didn't even, for the most part, IT didn't know Figma was even in the company, because it's just a team using it. So those are the sorts of challenges that people face now. It's personal devices. You think of it 10 years ago, a phone was, first of all, it was probably, maybe 15 years ago, it was a BlackBerry, right? And things like that. And then 2005 started to change. And now a phone, like you try and convince my 24-year-old son that the phone isn't a virtual version of himself, you'll fail. And so now people want to use, sure, company devices, but also personal devices. Sure, the enterprise apps that are deployed and probably behind your typical SSO, but also all of these SaaS apps that come in. And the businesses have gone from being really against that to now where it's like, hey, what's most important for almost any business? We have to succeed. We have to grow. How do you do that? You be productive. Well, how do you be productive? You let your employees be productive. I always say it this way. At the end of every year, almost every employee gets a performance evaluation. How many of those employees get a performance evaluation based on, did you only use company devices? Did you only use company app, right? No, it's like, did you make your results, whatever it is, in marketing and go to market and design and finance? Everyone's going to have different ones, but it's all based on their own. If we can make the employees productive, the company can be productive, but we still need to keep the company safe. And so it's now that same problem that we had back when I started, in 2012, of productivity and security coming together, and how do we have them not be at odds? But the problem space is different now. The problem space is, how do we do that with devices and apps? And how do we allow you as an individual to choose which apps, or largely choose which apps are going to make you and your team successful? Largely use your devices that make sense, which is probably your company issued device during the workday. But in the evenings or on the weekends or things like that, it's probably your personal device. If you get a Slack or whatever that comes in, you have to address. And so how do we make the human productive, and how do we give the tools to the business that allows them to allow their their employees to be productive, but also to keep the business safe? And that's only going to get worse with AI, because one of the cool things to me about the way we're going with AI is you're going to have your little AI buddy, right? Your AI paperclip, for those who remember Clippy, who's going to help you with everything you do, but you're going to have to give that AI a ton of power. And that's going to be scary. Some of that power is going to be business power. In other words, you're going to give them access to, so you might have a Salesforce, and then they're going to have their AI agent running to say if your pacing is on target. But it might be also something where it's like, hey, you just book me my travel. And not only is it going to have access to the company stuff, but it's going to have your passport and all of your other information. And so how do we do that in a way that allows us as individuals to keep our information that we need to keep private, our information secure, but again, productivity. So that's the part that privacy and security is such a big opportunity that we can just navigate our way into what parts of that can we solve best.
As you sort of started to talk about this, the second chapter of the company, when you built teams and then you built the business product, you haven't talked that much about how you thought about go-to-market. At what point did different traditional go-to-market functions start to get built, in what order?
I mean, it came through hard work. We were fortunate. We did have good product market fit. And because of that, a lot of organic inbound from customers. And so for the first, 2016 and then 2018, we formally launched 1Password for Business because we had a lot more of the capabilities. Obviously, continue to build 7 years later, but that's when we started to get a lot more, I'd say, real businesses really entering. And with that, it was still half of us are customer support, half of us were engineers, build a good product, support our customers.
And were most of the business customers, did they start as individual users of 1Password at home and in their family and brought it to work, or it wasn't that elegant? They'd actually just, a friend of theirs was leading IT at a company and really liked 1Password, and they adopted it in a more traditional fashion.
If a company came in, how would they sign up? They would go to the web, they would sign up for a free trial, and they put in a credit card. I kid you not. It doesn't matter the size of the company. We had some very large companies that would do that. And so that was considered a business. Like an individual who worked at a company wasn't a business. It was an actual business. So when we were still getting a ton of individuals, still getting a ton of families, but we were getting a lot of employees, like a lot of people using it because their company signed up. In most cases, in the vast majority of those cases, there was a person or people at that company that used us as individuals. And that was the flywheel for that company to get it. So in terms of the actual sum of businesses we got, the businesses by and large came because there's people of influence at that company that were using 1Password at the time. We weren't doing marketing outside of our website and things like that. So we started to see two things that started happening. One, I remember Rustam and I started to play with marketing. And I do mean play. So we went into Google AdWords and we were like, what ads, what words should we bid on? And that was sort of the very start of marketing. From a go-to-market point of view, our customer support team started to have a group within them that would help the businesses, because we were now starting to get enough businesses, probably at this point in time, 10,000 I mean, maybe even 20,000 coming. Yeah, maybe even 20,000, something like that. Many of them small, but now growing in size as well. So as we started to have the bigger capabilities, and we were just at the point now where some of them started to need some legal things. And so we had an outside counsel that was helping us at the time, who we eventually hired in-house. And we had a team from customer support of folks who would actually talk to to these businesses, and maybe they needed an MSA. We started to slowly take invoice pricing and things like that. And for some of the larger deals, negotiate on pricing, because again, it was all just, go to the website. So that just started to, I would say, force the need for, a sales team, as we called it at the time. It was all inbound. It was all organic. We didn't have any outbound or things like that. And then over the next couple of years, it started to evolve a little bit. I actually hired a company. A friend of mine had started a digital marketing agency. That's what Rosetta was technically, a digital marketing agency. He did the the bidding, the SEO and the SEM. And so I'd hired him to come and do a review of our website from an SEO point of view. And then they stayed on and ran some of our SEM for a while. It was very nascent. It was very small, but it was just the start of it. And then we started to try and mature our go-to-market team a little bit, right? Like I said, we brought the counsel in-house, and we separated that group. I think there's 6. We were getting in a couple of cases, some very big companies, that I and a couple others would go and visit as part of the sales cycle. And that's when it occurred to me, we need to grow these orgs, but I don't know how to do that. I know how to do it from one standpoint, and that is you get in good leaders who know how to do it. What I didn't know how to do is attract world-class leaders in areas outside of what 1Password was traditionally known for, especially because we had been so private. We were still bootstrapped, still, running independently, that nobody knew, were we successful? Were we not successful? Were we growing? Were we broke? Nobody had a clue. And you're not going to come to 1Password, especially to come build a go-to-market or a marketing. You're not even going to look our way without some reason. And so that led in the sort of the middle of 2019 for me to actually bluntly go to Arun and say, okay, let's talk. So I had built relationships with a ton of VCs over the years. More to the point, VCs had come and built relationships with me. And they're smart people. I'm more than happy to listen to anyone. But I always had sort of the same comment, look, I don't know what we do with your money. We've got our own money, just we were smart with our money, and we built it up from nothing and had remained a business and remained profitable. And so there wasn't a need. Well, now there was a need, and the need wasn't specifically money, but the need was what we could do. And that's where the first round of funding came from, was how do we announce ourselves to the world per se, so that I can hire world-class talent, world-class leaders. And that's what we did. So at the end of 2019, we announced the first ever funding round, was the $200 million round with Accel. And in January, I hired Jeannie as my CFO, now COO, and she was my first executive hire. She was actually introduced to us through Accel, through David Fogno, who I had met through Accel. And then, over the next few years, hired the rest of the C-suite. And also, I called 2020 a year growing and growing up. So growing, we had grown from 176 people, I want to say we had at the end of 2019 to, now the 1,400, but also maturing, right? Build a real go-to-market team, build a good marketing team, do proper financing and things like that, as well as continuing to make sure we're product-led and we're growing customer support org, and we're growing our engineering org at the same time.
You only just hinted at this, but what was the thinking behind choosing to be bootstrapped for 15-ish years? And what were the biggest positives of making that decision that maybe are only clear looking in the rear view?
Yeah. So, Dave, Sarah, Rustam, and Natalia were the ones that started it. And they started it, like I said, in the proverbial basement, and it grew over time. So I don't know that they had a plan at the earliest of stages to stay bootstrapped as much as it just sort of organically happened that way.
Which is interesting, because so much of the company's origin feels like it just sort of flowed out of them. It wasn't, we're going to go build a company. It sort of had this step-by-step sort of nature.
And I think that's one of the benefits of staying bootstrapped. So, for instance, when I came in 2012, first couple of years, it was very much of just, the first year in particular was just trying to figure out what were the opportunities and getting us into in things like localization and translation and do a better Android app and a Windows app. So we had a more broader suite, and that gave us the opportunity to look at B2B when it started to come about. But when I look at it from a bootstrapping point of view, the challenge there becomes, how do you grab and run after every opportunity? Your vision doesn't have to be super set. And I think that's the side of it that when I look at it from a bootstrapping point of view, if we had gone funding, I could be wrong because again, we didn't do funding early on, but my perception of it is they want to know where you're going. They want to know when you'll get there. They want to know what that opportunity is, as opposed to what we call our North Star. And our North Star is what we as a company do, right? It's that combination of productivity and security, bringing that convenience and security together for humans in a way that allows humans to be productive in businesses or their families to be safe. That's our North Star. That's where we're going at. And instead of saying like in 5 years and in 10 years, the same thing with my career. Like, if you'd asked me back when I was younger, what do you want to do in 5 years? I don't know. I can tell you what I'd want next. And it's that same sort of thing. And then it's jumping after each opportunity requires a degree of flexibility and a degree of just, I don't want to say bravery, but I don't have a better word for it, gumption, whatever word you want to use. When I looked at it from a B2B point of view, it would be a great example. Like I said, it was quite literally, that night at dinner that everything just clicked. And the next morning we were in the room at that hotel on the whiteboard, drawing out what we would need. We didn't think about how we were going to explain it to VCs, whether or not we, needed to get permission or any of that. We just said, we believe in this, done. Like that's the jump after it, because we know it's in our North Star direction. Again, it's not, it'd be really cool if we made this other thing. Even if that other thing is super exciting, like that's just like, that's what our company is for. And so this was squarely in there. It was an obvious extension in some ways of what we were doing. But again, taking us from an app, taking us from individuals really only into, we have to build a SaaS app. We've got to build all of this B2B. Like, it was a huge jump and a huge risk from that perspective that we didn't have to convince anybody other than really the group of 5 of us that this made sense for us to do. And even there, it wasn't an economic decision other than, do we have enough money, to fund this so that we can give it a try? So I would say that the benefits are that flexibility. Now, on the opposite side, what if we didn't have enough money to make it happen? Or what if it took 3 years longer than we had planned, or things like that? So there's definitely downsides, but I would say if you've got a great vision, a great North Star, but you don't know exactly where that trajectory is going to bring you, you need that flexibility, because otherwise what you're thinking today might be useful in 5 years, may not be useful in 5 years. The next 5 years are going to bring us tremendous change. So how do I set that direction, that path, that fundamental vision or problem to solve, and stay flexible and not have to spend all of my time trying to convince others that I should be able to do this? That's the benefit.
Do you look back and you can clearly see that at certain points there would have been benefits if you chose to raise capital?
Hindsight being 2020, I would have raised capital earlier. You can get to a point where you're proud of things you should no longer be proud of. Maybe said a better way, the things that you're proud of can inhibit you. And so, once you've been bootstrapped for 10 years and everybody's like, wow, you've grown this great company, all bootstrap. How impressive is that? That becomes your identity, becomes a blocker when it's like, does that mean I'm less successful if I take funding? You just have to try and ignore those and ignore those thoughts in your own head. If we had marketing and go-to-market and real marketing, real go-to-market, if we had been more mature earlier, that would have helped us, because in some ways we're a company that's been around for, 19 years. In others, we've been around for 4 now, going on 5 years. And the changes over the last 4 or 5 years have been dramatic, but in every aspect. That's tough to keep your focus, right? And so if we had an extra couple of years, then go-to-market would have been ahead by a couple of years, and marketing would have been ahead. It's easy to look back and say that that's true, but I think in hindsight, I waited too long for that. But I do think going B2B would have been very challenging in an environment where we had funding based on a consumer experience. You could certainly see the opposite, right? Like If we were B2B, if any company's B2B and says, hey, we want to go after the consumers, their investors will be like, no, you're not.
When you look back in the 13 years that you've been at the company, what do you think are the most skillful things that you've done?
Focus on the human. We really do care about the experience that people have with the app. That can be something that can be easily lost, especially as you grow and change and move into B2B and things like that. You could start to think, well, businesses don't care about that. The consumers do. We care about that. And to the point where at times we've had to defend that, not greatly, even with, VCs and stuff like that. It's like, are we spending too much time and focus? I think everybody understands now that's going to be our advantage. That's going to be the reason why people choose us. But I would say that focus and maintaining that focus has really been the reason that we've been successful.
This sort of simple idea of being customer-centric or building delightful software. How do you keep that alive all of the time now that you're at scale other than talking about it?
At some level, it all comes down to people. So I would look at even how I got hired as an example. So that was set by Dave, Sarah, Rustam, and Natalia, right? We were going to listen to our customers. We're going to build a usable app. Like that was what really mattered to them. And it's what attracted me to the company in part. And so they saw that in me and they're like, okay, Jeff can be a shepherd of that as well, as opposed to having to train, somebody that this matters. So you have to look for that in people. Now, in certain roles, to be clear, right? We have to look at that from a design point of view. You have to look at that from a product point of view. You have to look at that from your most senior execs that they're going to understand the value, because you can have plaques on every wall or whatever you want. None of that matters, right? People are going to lead, especially as you grow and you give more people responsibility for things. So it does come down to, are the people in the foremost positions at a minimum aware of and supportive of that as your unfair advantage? If you can do that, then it's very easy to just gain the momentum and say, yep, we're going to continue to do that. It's part of the reason why, when we look at Collide, so for instance, Collide's a company that we acquired last year, and Jason, who's the founder, had a very similar philosophy. It's part of the reason why that made sense to us. It wasn't just buying a technology. Now you can buy technology for technology's sake, but then you're going to have to look at the UX side of it and redo it. But that was really important to him. And again, I looked at his company and it all fit and everything, but also he as a person, I'm like, he's going to help us maintain that. That matters to him. It was personal to him. And he's going to be in a position of influence on the product side here. And he's going to make sure that continues. I think that's the only real way. You have to do all of the other things. You have to tell everybody it's important. You have to be able to demonstrate that, but it's going to come down to, are you hiring people that really care?
You sort of shared the origin story of how you kicked off the whole process to go B2B. And it seems like one of those kind of pivotal moments or pivotal stories in the company's life. Are there any other sort of moments like that come to mind that you think are like some of the input drivers of what's made the company so wonderful?
Oddly enough, when we went for the round of funding, it's a weird thing to say when you ended your sentence with that made the company so wonderful, because that's not certainly how I would have thought of funding. But the funding round was such a pivotal moment. And there's two things I would say that were really pivotal about it. One was, again, Dave, Sarah, Rustam, Natalia, and I, it was our company before that. We made the decisions. Again, we had the broader team and stuff like that, and the company was getting larger, but it was still very much, nobody had to decide but us if we wanted to do something. And so giving that up, even in some way, we made sure we retained ownership and we didn't give up very much to the company and all of those sorts of, but it doesn't matter. It's still just, it felt very much like we were giving some sense of control to this other entity that wasn't us, that we had so many heart-to-hearts internally between the five of us about the pros and cons. It was a huge emotional exercise for us to understand.
What was that conversation like?
It was, why would we do this? It was like, what do we think we will gain is really what it came down to. And then it was, what do we think we will lose? How do we technically or legally or whatever the word is, prevent ourselves from losing it? So those are the bulk of the discussions. And then every once in a while, we'd have the real discussion. How do we feel? And those were the raw, we're feeling excitement, but we're also feeling fear. Like it wasn't ignore all of the data. It was just, how do we feel? And those were the discussions we needed to have. And we were close enough as friends to have. And there wasn't a reason for any of our feelings. We recognized that. The concerns were so easily mitigated, especially we were in a good position. We were able to sit there and say, like, we're not giving up. There's no magic voting rights, no magic dates we have to hit, right? I mean, they just, wanted us to continue to grow and all those sorts of things. So the emotions were just, I don't want to say unfounded. Like, emotions are always founded, but it was something we just had to be honest with each other about and admit that this was yet another case of somewhat conceptually similar to the B2B side of, like, this is an exciting opportunity and we're scared because we have to take a big risk. And what have we always done when we've looked at the big risks? We've looked at it and we said, let's, understand our emotion. Let's recognize that it's there. But this is the right thing to do. Let's take this risk. And it was the same thing with funding, because the reason we were doing it was to go and hire people that could grow world-class organizations for us that we couldn't get another way. And so once we started to look at again, the pros and cons, how do you really mitigate the cons so that they weren't a real concern? Then it was about just facing your emotions. And anytime you do that, you're like, okay, like, it's okay to be scared. That's how we move the company forward. That's where the five of us being friends makes all of the difference in the world. We can have those discussions. That's why even when I look at our C-suite now, that's why we try and get together so often as people. You need to be friends. Yeah, you may not be friends on some of us are, some of us aren't, but on a go for a whatever basketball game, but you need to know each other as people, because you need to make those decisions.
Maybe just to wrap up, we'll end with the question we always do, which is, for you personally, who's the person that's had the biggest impact on you, in this case, as a CEO?
Many years ago, I was a developer at IBM, and Mike Pullen was my boss. And our team lead had left the company. And so I went to Mike Pullen and I said to him, I want to be the team lead. And I laid out my reasons for being the team lead. He says to me, okay, but I'm not going to tell anyone. Well, I thought, what a jerk. And so 6 months later, I was the team lead. And I finally asked him, like, well, what was that all about? He goes, 3 people came to me that day. And I told them all the same thing. He goes, a leader leads. It's not, yes, having the title and everything can help, but a leader leads. And so who was going to actually lead? And I led. And that to me is, now I wouldn't do that. I've never done that to anyone. I'm not sure that was necessarily the best way, but it was the lesson I needed to hear. And so, from a CEO point of view, and that was a team lead of a small team with a ton of support and everything, but it's still, leaders lead. And that doesn't mean that you're going to go out, and every type of leader can be different. You have the type of leaders, I'm going to march this way and 100 miles an hour, and I'm only going to hire people that are going to be behind me and not challenge me, but also walk 100 miles an hour. And that can work. There's the type of leader that are going to be a lot more collaborative and things like that, but you have to lead. The responsibility is ultimately yours. It doesn't matter who makes a decision. When you support that decision, that's your decision and you have to take it. So, I would say being a CEO is it's very lonely. It's tough. It's rewarding. It's a bunch of things, but lead. And lead doesn't mean on your own, but it does mean take all that responsibility, put it on your shoulders, and then, make sure that you've got your teams back so that it's always, you're with them on those decisions. But that was many years ago, and I will probably die thinking about that.
Nice. Great place to end. Thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, it's been fun.